Hey, Charger History. Today's essential question is, why was the Nile River so important? Please pause your video and copy this essential question across the top of your page. Go ahead and draw your vertical line for your notes. Think back to yesterday. Yesterday we learned about the geography of Egypt. We learned that both red land, the dry, barren desert, and black land, the fertile soil, were helpful to Egyptians in different ways. Do you remember the ways that each feature helped the Egyptians? So ancient Egyptian society has a nickname. It's called the gift of the Nile. Without the Nile River, no life could have existed in ancient Egypt back then or in Egypt today. Egyptians counted on the fresh water and fertile soil from the Nile to breathe life into their desert region. Compared to the Tigris and Euphrates, the Nile River was much more reliable. The Tigris and Euphrates, you never knew when they would either flood or have a drought, leaving irrigation channels dry and unhelpful. The Nile was different though. With the Nile, it was very predictable on a cycle of when the waters would be high and when they would be low. Because of that, the Nile just lent this peaceful feeling to ancient Egypt. People loved their river. They loved the Nile. Please write the first central idea in your notes, Nile River. The Nile River is the longest river in the world. It runs from the south to the north, and it had predictable floods. Pause if you need more time to copy. So following the calendar every single year, it never strayed from this schedule. The river began to rise in southern Egypt in early July, and it reached flood stage by mid-August. The flood then moved to the north, getting to the northern end of the valley about 4 to 6 weeks later. At its peak, the Nile would cover entire floodplains to a depth of 5 feet. The waters would begin to go down in the south by early October. So in October and November, there was silt left over from the river flood. Most of the valley was drained dry, just with silt left over. Egyptian farmers had before them well-watered fields of fertile soil that had been naturally fertilized by the silt. They planted wheat and other important crops, just as the mild winter was beginning. So it was, again, a mild winter. The climate was just right, not too hot. And they were able to harvest or pick their crops here's them planting in December in the mild winter. So see what they're using. What's this tool called? Okay, and then they were able to harvest their plants in April and May. This is real Egyptian art showing people harvesting or pulling their crops. By this time, the river's flow had stopped. The floodplain was completely dry. But magically, to the ancient Egyptians, the cycle then started all over again every year. Even now, today, every June 17th is a holiday that's celebrated called the Night of the Drop. It's called this because ancient Egyptians believed that a god's teardrop fell to the earth and caused the Nile to flood again. In your notebook, please draw these 2 boxes. Label 1, the Nile in the winter, and 1, the Nile in the summer. Remember that the waters were low in the wintertime, allowing farmers to plant their crops and harvest their crops. And the Nile in the summer, the waters had risen, and now the river was back, flooding the fields. Please draw a picture of what the Nile looked like in the winter and what the Nile looked like in the summer. Pause your video and take 1 minute only to draw your 2 pictures. Go. So when the Nile rivers were low, there was no water covering the farmland, and ancient Egyptians were able to plant, cultivate, and harvest their crops. But check this picture out. When the Nile River was high, the land was covered in water. When the waters were high, Egyptians still used so much of the Nile. They used the Nile to fish by throwing spears at the water like you see these people doing. They got so good at it that they could throw a spear and catch a fish every time. They used the Nile also to travel north to the Mediterranean Sea so that they could trade with Mesopotamians and other neighbors. They also traveled south on the river to barter with the Nubians, who could also be called Cushites. And these people lived right beneath their civilization in the region also along the Nile. And so again, Egyptians were able to go south on the river and get to all these other colonies so that they could trade with them. Go ahead and write your second central idea, trade along the Nile. Some important things that Egyptians would trade were a cloth called linen, which were made out of linseed plants. Also papyrus, which is Egyptian paper, and also wheat. Wheat was their crop that grew best, so they had a lot of it. They had a surplus. Let's find out what it was that they wanted the most when they gave these crops. What did they want to get back?
And to it, and along it, flowed trade controlled by the kings of Cush at Kerm. In the desert outside the city is a recently discovered ruin which Derek thinks is a staging post on a trade route linking up with the Nile at Kerm.
This is very clear evidence for trade and contact with Egypt. We have this very distinctive pottery here, these ribbed pottery vessels, wheel-made, typical Egyptian products, being brought down here into the heartlands of the Kingdom of Cush. The pots themselves are just like the tin cans of the ancient world. They're the containers, and it's the produce within them that was being imported into this region.
Cush exported to Egypt the African goods it most desired: ivory, ebony, and wild animal skins. But above all, the pharaohs lusted after Cush's gold mines. It was gold they most revered. Gold that secured the pharaoh's power and proclaimed their divinity. Gold, the flesh of gods, conferred immortality on those who wore it and were buried wrapped in it. The pharaoh's need for gold gave power to the kings of Cush, but it has taken archaeologists many years to reveal the true extent of Cushite power.
So again, the Nile was the avenue for trade from Egypt to the southern place called Cush, which was an African civilization. What was it that Cush was able to offer to the Egyptians? That's right. Please add gold to your notes and write your last central idea, cultural diffusion. Cultural diffusion is the spread of goods and ideas to new places. Pause if you need more time. So the Nile River caused cultural diffusion by acting as a highway for the Egyptians to barter and communicate with other places. For example, Mesopotamian technologies, like the irrigation method shown here, called the shaduf, this idea traveled to Egypt through river trade and sea trade. But above all, more than anything else, even more important than trade, the Egyptian civilization was the gift of the Nile because of its floods, which allowed people to grow food in the fertile soil, when really their region was just so much desert. So the most important job of the Nile was to provide that fertile soil. All right, please go back to your playlist for practice. Click Nile Trivia and complete the trivia questions independently to show what you know about the Nile River.